What happens when an action legend known for discipline and power steps into a morning interview, only to be ambushed on live television? This isn't a joke. This is the raw, unscripted clash that had producers panicking, cameras rolling, and one of America's most iconic figures walking off the set with security trailing behind him. What started as a routine Good Morning America interview became one of the most shocking live confrontations in morning TV history. Before we reveal the moment everything went off the rails, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more explosive stories right here on Narrative Nest. You'll want to hear every word of this. Chuck Norris arrived on the GMA set that morning expecting a calm, respectful conversation. The tone? A feel-good segment. Maybe some questions about his latest charity, and a chuckle over the endless memes that paint him as an unstoppable force of nature. The studio buzzed in its usual rhythm. Crew resetting lights, makeup doing touch-ups, producers whispering on headsets. Chuck, calm and poised, adjusted his trademark black shirt and nodded graciously to the team. Meanwhile, host George Stephanopoulos, usually warm and polite during off-air setup, had his eyes glued to his notes, brows furrowed. Something felt off. No pre-show small talk. No polite banter. Just silence and cold focus. The red light on the main camera blinked on. "I'm joined today by Chuck Norris," George began, his tone immediately more rigid than expected. "A man some people call a legend. Others say a myth. Let's clear the air. Do you really believe the stuff people say about you online?" Chuck blinked once, clearly surprised by the confrontational tone. But decades of martial arts discipline kept his voice steady. "Well, George," he replied, "those jokes are just that, jokes. They're fun. But at their core, they represent strength, perseverance, and having a little fun with exaggeration. I'm proud if people see inspiration in them." George didn't flinch. He leaned forward. "But doesn't it feel ridiculous? Grown adults believing you counted to infinity, twice, or that you split atoms with a roundhouse kick. Doesn't that make your entire image a caricature?" The temperature in the studio dropped. A couple of camera operators exchanged glances. Chuck's smile faded slightly. His tone cooled. "I think you're missing the spirit of it. Those jokes represent a mindset. They're metaphors, not facts. People need to believe in something powerful. Something enduring. If I can symbolize that, I accept it with humility." George wasn't having it. "Or maybe you've just built a brand off people's gullibility. A carefully crafted persona of invincibility. You're not a superhero. You're an actor." Chuck's hands, resting calmly until now, slowly tightened on the arms of his chair. His jaw tensed. "But still," he replied without raising his voice, "I'm also a real martial artist. A world champion. A teacher. I've trained thousands. I've bled for my belts. And I've always said I'm human. I've never claimed to be more. But I won't sit here and let you belittle the work of millions who dedicate their lives to discipline." That's when George went in for the first hard blow. "Let's talk movies. Walker. Texas Ranger. The action films. They're not exactly masterpieces. Do you ever wonder if you've contributed anything meaningful, or if your entire legacy is a joke?" Chuck didn't move. But his eyes, those legendary eyes that once made on-screen villains freeze, locked onto George with quiet fire. "You know what, George? I've made people laugh, cheer, cry. I've brought families together. My shows taught honor, justice, and courage. I've created thousands of jobs, inspired generations. What have you done, besides criticize from a desk?" George smirked. "I inform the public. I expose corruption. I hold people accountable. I don't need to pretend to be a warrior." Chuck leaned forward. "Pretend." That single word, uttered softly, rattled the studio. The crew collectively held its breath. "You think what I've done is pretend? The tournaments? The championships? The years of training? You think this is all for show? George pressed on, visibly emboldened by the intensity. You choreographed fights. You're protected by cameras and editors. You haven't lived a real fight in decades. You've become a brand. Chuck Norris. Chuck exhaled sharply. Not in defeat, but to hold back what was rising in him. I fought men twice my size in arenas where the only safety was your own skill. I've taught kids self-respect. I've supported veterans, first responders, and sick children. I've built something real. That matters. George's voice dipped into arrogance. Does it? You're a meme now. A punchline. A collection of jokes passed around like Bigfoot sightings. How does it feel to be laughed at instead of honored? Chuck looked away, jaw clenched. Laughed at, he said, slowly turning back to George. I see people smile. I see hope. If you see ridicule, that says more about you than me. George didn't blink. And what about your politics? Your endorsements of conspiracy theories? Your fringe alliances? You call that leadership? You've weaponized your brand to push fear and misinformation. Chuck froze. The words hit him like a cheap shot in a fight. You're accusing me of deception? Of leading people astray? Based on what? Twitter rumors. George folded his hands smugly. Based on what you've supported. What you've failed to condemn. Your silence speaks volumes. Chuck's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. You don't know me. You don't know the families I've helped, the veterans I've stood beside, the people I've saved from addiction and violence through my schools. You only know headlines. Clickbait. You don't want truth. You want a takedown. George leaned back. I want accountability. I ask what others are afraid to ask. I'm not scared of a black belt. Chuck finally rose to his feet. Slowly, deliberately. His shadow towered over the host's desk. The room went still. Chuck's voice was low, controlled, icy. Stand up, George. George's composure cracked. He laughed nervously. What? Stand up. George didn't move. Chuck stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You called me a fraud. A fake. You questioned my honor. My entire life. You want to do that? Do it face to face. George glanced at the crew. His pride and fear wrestled silently. Chuck leaned over the desk. I won't touch you, but I will look you in the eye. Like a man. Like a warrior. That's more than you've done this whole interview. George's voice trembled just enough to be noticeable. I'm not here for theatrics. Chuck didn't move. You already made it a performance. I'm just giving it a real ending. The studio lights seemed hotter. The silence deeper. George stayed seated, and that choice spoke volumes. Chuck stared down at him. That's what I thought. Chuck Norris walked off the set. The crew watched in stunned silence as he moved past the cameras, the cables, the monitors. No shouting. No grand gestures. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything the world would be talking about for days. Maybe even years. George sat down heavily in his chair, visibly rattled. A sheen of sweat glistened on his brow as he tried to compose himself. For a moment, he just stared at the teleprompter, as if willing it to rewind time. But the damage was done. Across the studio, stunned silence still hung in the air. Camera operators whispered. A producer covered her mouth. The floor director tried to reset the schedule, but no one was listening. The interview was over. But the fallout was just beginning. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation exploded across social media. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Unedited footage from inside the GMA studio hit the internet like a tidal wave. The hashtag Chuck walks out trended within the hour. And the memes, oh, the irony, began flooding in. Except this time, they weren't jokes about Chuck Norris roundhouse kicking mountains into dust or arm wrestling thunder. No. This time, they were moments of icy silence, of devastating comebacks, of calm strength under fire. Chuck Norris didn't lose his temper. He handed George his reputation with surgical precision. That tweet got over 2 million likes. News anchors debated the ethics of the interview. Was it a setup? A character assassination? Or was Chuck Norris simply too thin-skinned to handle a journalist's questions? But most of the public wasn't confused. They saw what happened. They saw a respected martial artist ambushed, belittled, and baited for entertainment. And they saw a man walk away from the fire with his dignity fully intact. Days later, Chuck issued a short statement on his website. I went on Good Morning America to talk about service, discipline, and perseverance. I walked into an ambush. I chose not to fight with my fists or raise my voice. I chose to walk away. That's what real strength looks like. Chuck. That message, simple and direct, was reposted by veterans groups, martial arts organizations, and thousands of fans who had looked up to him for decades. Meanwhile, George Stephanopoulos faced internal scrutiny. ABC News held emergency meetings. Executives watched the footage on repeat, weighing journalistic integrity against public backlash. Sponsors voiced concern. Viewers wrote in by the thousands. And George? He stayed quiet. No tweet. No comment. Just silence. But the silence wasn't protective. It was damning. Chuck, on the other hand, returned to what he always did best. Teaching. He was spotted just days later at one of his martial arts academies in Texas, wearing his GI, instructing young students on the importance of humility and respect. A reporter finally caught up with him outside the studio. Mr. Norris, do you regret walking off the interview? Chuck paused, then gave a small, steady smile. Not for a second. That was it. No anger. No elaboration. Just truth. It wasn't long before media figures began openly criticizing George. Not because they disliked him personally, but because what he'd done, baiting a guest under false pretenses, broke an unspoken code. One respected anchor from a rival network said bluntly, George tried to make Chuck crack. Instead, Chuck showed us what poise under pressure really looks like. Even late-night comedians, who usually made Chuck the punchline, came to his defense. Say what you want about Chuck Norris, one joked, but he just stared a hostile interview down and walked out like a final boss. Meanwhile, fans flooded George's social media. Some expressed disappointment. Others, pure outrage. You lost the room, George. You crossed a line. That man has done more for real people than you'll ever understand. It became clear that George hadn't just lost an interview, he'd lost the respect of millions. And Chuck. He gained something far more powerful than viral fame. He gained a new chapter in his legacy. Not the meme. Not the action hero. Not the Texas Ranger. But the warrior who didn't flinch. Weeks passed. George finally issued a public statement, clipped and clinical. As a journalist, I believe in asking difficult questions. That said, it was never my intent to upset Mr. Norris. I regret the tone of the interview and how it was perceived. Perceived? That word triggered another firestorm. Perceived meant denial. Perceived meant, it's not what I said, it's how you heard it. The statement fell flat. Chuck, meanwhile, was invited on multiple shows to clear the air. He declined all of them. Instead, he released a short video. No flashy intro. No dramatic music. Just him, sitting in his dojo, calm as ever. I don't need to explain myself, he said. The footage speaks louder than words. I won't trash George or ABC. That's not who I am. But I will say this. The world doesn't need more gotcha journalism. It needs honor. It needs truth. And it needs men and women willing to walk away from ego toward principle. The video was watched over 40 million times in 72 hours. And with that, Chuck Norris once again became something bigger than a man. He became a moment. A moment when honor stood taller than ego. When character walked off a stage instead of being dragged into the mud. When silence spoke louder than any insult. That moment, raw, unscripted, and unshakable, reminded the world what dignity actually looks like. So what really happened that day? Was George's plan to provoke Chuck from the very beginning? Did the producers know they were setting a trap? Was this about views or vengeance? We may never know the full story behind the cameras, but here's what matters. Chuck Norris didn't cave. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch. He stood up. He called out the ambush. He walked away with strength and stillness. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing a man can do. If this story shook you, if you believe in truth over spectacle, if you respect strength that doesn't need to shout, then do one thing right now. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to Narrative Nest, where we bring you the untold stories, the dramatic confrontations, and the moments that expose who people really are when the cameras start rolling. Bell, hit that notification bell. Studio microphone, drop a comment below. Was Chuck right to walk off? Did George go too far? What would you have done? Because the truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks away.